So, let's just recap Shaka. Because of Shaka, much of Natal south of the Tugela and Mzinyathi was considered as terra nullius due to the clan remnants remaining after the Mthembu and Mchunu depredations of 1822 and 1823. And remember that the settlers arrived in around that particular time. So the arrival of traders in 1823 and 1824 met with Shaka, and he ceded land to them, and that was that patch of land south of the Tugela around where the contemporary city of Durban sits. And these guys set up a rough trading post where the city of Durban now stands. And they traded inland, but all of their trade was carried out through the sanction of Shaka. So Dingaan is a really interesting character. In 1828, Dingaan and a couple of his followers assassinated Shaka at Shaka's military homestead, his Ikanda, which was situated at KwaZulu-Natal, where the city of KwaZulu-Natal now stands. Dingaan Dingaan took over the rulership from Shaka, and as such, he for me is really interesting because he inherited not only the tribal structure or the structures which Shaka had put into place in order to be able to rule the umbrella group of the extended Zulu clan that he had formed, but he was also stuck between a rock and a hard place because he was having to deal with the British settlers, but also the Dutch settlers who arrived in from the north in 1838. So Dingaan really was somebody who I think had to work with extreme diplomacy because of his relationship with the people he'd inherited and the groups he'd inherited, but also be able to work between two different sets of white settlers near the twain shall meet as far as they're concerned. So again, we look at the map, we can see the red line of the area to the northeast of which was the territory inhabited by the Zulu people under Shaka and later Dingaan, and then to the south was the pink area, which was the land ceded to the white traders by Shaka in 1824. So all of those lands, sort of where you see signs of Les Escort and Ladysmith, those lands were all reasonably, in inverted commas, empty. There were some remnants of Hlubi people living in the area around Escort, and they had been unseated quite ignominiously in the 1830s. But certainly these particular lands were quite attractive to the Dutch farmers who, escaping the British in the Cape in 1838, remember that British rule started again in about 1806 in the Cape. Escaping British rule, they moved north in something which is known as the Great Trek, and they moved north and ironically started moving into the territory under a mixture of Zulu rule to the north and trader rule to the south. They started moving into the inland area of this particular territory. And it's really important to know that the Dutch were really similar to the Zulu. I spoke much earlier about the different life ways and that the Zulu were very much a mixed life way, which really gave them a centrality around cattle, but then they were also able to supplement the foodstuffs that cattle provided with grain that they were growing. And the Dutch were very similar. They were also predominantly cattle farmers, and one of the reasons they had left the Cape was in order to be able to find extensive farmland in order to be able to run their cattle. And so the early discussions between the Dutch moving in from the north and the Zulu were around a cession of land for these Dutch settlers between the Dutch and the Zulu. And these were brokered between Dingaan and a group of people, and they were moving into those particular areas there. These were brokered between Dingaan and a guy called Piet Retief, who was basically the advocate for the Dutch settlers, who in 1838 went to visit Dingaan at his homestead at Ngungutlovu, which is close to modern-day Ulundi, and tried to negotiate about a cession of land. However, this particularly did not go very well for Retief because he and his followers were all murdered by Dingaan, and this particular event led to an interpretation pretty much until about the 1980s and early 1990s that Dingaan was the despot rather than Shaka. And so this particular event led to a series of battles which were fought in the area between Escort and Ladysmith, and these were battles for access to land between the Boers and the Zulu. It must also be said that the Boers set up their capital at what is today the city of Pietermaritzburg. Pietermaritzburg itself is a contraction of a number of Boer settler names, and they set up their capital of Natalia there in 1838. And remember that the British were just down the road in Durban, a scarce 80 kilometers away, and these were the British traders. So the battles between the Dutch and the Zulu were largely located in the area around the central inland region, and these particular battles are quite celebrated. The Battle of Ncome Blood River, for example, was one which was celebrated quite extensively by the Dutch in 1838, as this was a site in which a very small number of Dutch settlers drove off Zulus under Dingaan at Blood River, and this particular event, which was the culmination of a number of battles, basically led to a reasonably permanent Dutch settlement, although it didn't last for very long, given the location of the British. So the Dutch went ahead, set up their capital at Natalia, at Pietermaritzburg, and they also started giving out land. And the Dutch land grants were pretty much a casual affair, unlike the British, which were carefully measured and carefully audited. The Dutch land grants were pretty casual, in which a guy would literally climb on his horse and ride around a particular area, and the land was granted to him depending on the amount of land he managed to cover in one day. And these land grants were generally grants of about 6,000 acres, and as noted, these were deemed sufficient in order to be able to run cattle. And this is what many of the early Boer farmers did in the areas in the Midlands and the interior of the contemporary province. So while the Dutch had set up their capital at Natalia, the British traders were still doing their thing down on the coast in Port Natal, there was yet another despotic event, shall we put it that way, in which Mpande effectively managed to come to rule with the death of Dingaan in 1840. And Mpande, who, remember, was always deemed as somebody who would never be suitable to rule, Mpande came to rule and took over not only the inherited situation that Dingaan had left, and this now includes a whole bunch of British, a whole bunch of Boers, and then also this very complex new Zulu nation. He managed to rule for the next 32 years. So he aligned himself rather than the Boers and the British, and he saw them as allies in defending Zulu-owned territories, and certainly much of the political history of the next certainly next 30 or 40 years did have events of the Boers and the Zulus coming into allegiance with each other and fighting together in order to either be able to get territory from other Zulu clans or other Zulu related clans which were challenging Mpande, or else the British. So his Boer allies helped him defeat Dingaan in the hope that he would cede them land. Much of the land history in northern KwaZulu-Natal has its origins with Mpande's relations with the Boers. He also had a patent dislike for missionaries, and we find that during Mpande's rule, very few missionaries were actually allowed to gain traction in Zululand. And significantly, this particular period is interesting because there was all the sort of contestation for settlement between the British and the Boers going on in Natal across the border. But significantly, Mpande, being the end of the direct line of Senzangakona, his sons battled to the death in order to succeed him. And so the very seminal battle between Cetshwayo, who was the son who won the battle, against his brother Mboyazi, these also took in extra assistance from white traders and farmers who sought to benefit from the battle. And this particular battle was also quite important in the political history of Zululand and the relationship between Zulus in Zululand and white settlers and traders. So Mpande was ruling Zululand in 1840, and in 1843 things came to a head. We had the Boers in Natalia, at Pietermaritzburg in the interior, and they challenged the small British settlement at the coast. And remember that the settlement was still effectively a trading post. It had allegiance to a trading company in the Cape, but was not necessarily anything firmly to do with the British colony. And it was only after the Anglo-Boer War of 1843, in which the British settlement at Port Natal was held to siege by the Boers, that a guy called Dick King, and you can see him in the image there, famously undertook a massive ride to Grahamstown to get a British garrison in order to relieve the settlement at Natal. And with this went a guy called Ndongeni, and Ndongeni rode most of the trip with King, quite famously as well. And that in itself is another whole story. But the relief of the territory of Port Natal is something which has certainly gone down in the history books, because this became the point at which the British took control and Natal was annexed as a British colony. So this led to a relative stability. It led to a relative period of stability because there was this external arm of the British colony, or the Cape Colony particularly, in being able to help stabilize the relationships not only between the British and the Zulu to the north, but also the British to the Boers. And this also related in carrying out a land order to the rather random Zulu Boer grants, and these were resurveyed and reallocated to Boer settlers who proved that they could actually farm the land and they wanted to stay on the land, and also new applicants who were largely British settlers. At the same time, all of the lands which were previously randomly unallocated were allocated now as crown lands, and in order to be able to get money to be able to fill the fiscus to run the new colony, these crown lands were surveyed and granted. And so particularly between about 1848 and 1852, there was a significant uptake of new grants by immigrants, particularly after the massive amount of immigrants who came in about 1850. And this was due to a whole bunch of immigration schemes, not only of British immigrants, but also German immigrants. And so, for example, a significant number of German immigrants arrived in 1850, and most of these people settled in what are today the Midlands of KwaZulu-Natal. So many of the Boers left the province. They were not prepared to stay under the British, and many of the Boers left the new colony and moved north, moving back into what is the Cape, and then moving back into what is today the Transvaal. So this particular dispensation, the British were very much the British colony, or the British colonial endeavour, was very much a bean counter. And so one of the things they started to do was carefully assess the influx of African people into the colony across the Tugellerums and Yati River, as well as the residents that were in the territory at the same time. They set up a boundary commission in 1846, and the boundary commission of 1846 really resulted in the setting out of a series of locations into which clan groups were basically isolated. And so, for example, early locations include Zwartkop at Pietermaritzburg, at which the Zondi and the Zuma people were basically settled or demarcated. And quite historically important is the Umnini location, which was set up for the Trele people. And these early examples were ways in which the British were able to control and isolate specific clan groups of black people who'd come across the borders in order to be able to allow for crown grants and land allocation to whites. So this then led to the stability to be able to formalize town lands. So the town lands of Durban and Pietermaritzburg were laid out in the 1850s. And so this is one of the early, this is a July 1855 a Surveyor General plan of the townlands of Durban. And you can see here the city of Durban, the point, which is hatched, which really at that stage was still a sandy spur, but was an important landing place for new settlers. And you can see the sort of hatched area on the edges of the boundaries to the northeast as being what is called dense forest. And that area is the Berea of Durban, which until relatively recently, the end of the 19th century certainly, was reasonably well afforested. And so this led to the laying out of lands. You can see here the townlands of Durban, as in the previous image, contextualized with Cato Manor being a farm, Brickfield being a farm, Springfield being a farm, Kleinzeekoe, which is also a farm. It's Dutch, but it basically is a small hippo. The bluff lands, and then you can see state land along the edge of the bluff there. But these were all basically associated with specific personalities who'd purchased the properties. So Cato Manor, for example, is the farm owned by George Cato, who was one of the early settlers of Durban. And so together with other settlers who were largely traders or people casting their luck in a totally new colony, because things were pretty bad in England in the 1840s and 1850s, but also a series of missionaries who came out in order to be able to carry out good works as part of the expansionism. So these people set up rudimentary homesteads made out of vernacular materials. Often local African people helped to construct the buildings. So the understanding of wattle and daub and the use of thatch was something which was often transferred between Aboriginal inhabitants and the new settlers. So at the end of the 1840s, a very significant moment happened in which a guy called Theophilus Shepstone was appointed as the Secretary for Native Affairs. And this is quite seminal because he was a really interesting character. And the late Jeff Guy has written a very compelling history of this particular individual, because his relationship with the Zulu was incredibly strategic, incredibly close, and he was an incredibly fluent Zulu speaker. And Theophilus Shepstone was the guy who was responsible for setting up the locations of the Boundary Commission of 1846, but he was also the person that was responsible for the strategic direction in which the British colony took managing the native affairs. And so one of the first things he did was set up a hut tax, and this was first instituted around 1849. And the hut tax basically taxed people who lived in circular buildings and didn't tax people who lived in square buildings. And this particular relationship is based on the fact that people who lived in square buildings were generally people who'd moved onto mission stations and people who'd accepted the rule of God and the missionaries as their new life way, and square buildings were really the marker of a change of cognitive behavior between traditionally associated Africans and people moving on to missions. And so what this did was this set up a hut tax collection, and one of the more pejorative ways that this actually affected African families was that people, homestead owners, were taxed according to the number of different circular buildings or huts that they had in their particular homestead. Now, other lectures in this particular series may have told you that traditional Zulu societies were polygamous. And so, for example, if you had a wealthy Zulu guy, he would have a number of wives, and each of those wives would have a number of children. And so he was literally taxed for every single one of those buildings. And so Ramdani, for example, argued quite strongly that the hut tax was one of the ways that the British sought to control the number of wives that Zulu people had, but also be able to start eroding some of the traditional ways in which Zulus ran their homesteads. And on the other hand, as noted, this is an early settlement. This is an early photograph of Georgetown and Edendale, and this was an 1855 mission station set up by the Wesleyan missionary James Allison, who was quite quickly expelled, but became really the hotbed of political dissent and thinking amongst the Amakolwa, who were the converts, about who I will speak a bit more in a bit later. And then we look at the circular buildings as constructed by traditional Zulu people. And one of the reasons why I particularly love this drawing or this image is because of the window, which is installed into this particular beehive dwelling, which would have been traditionally quite critically looked down upon. So the next piece of really important information for you guys to know is that Theophilus Shepstone also instituted what is known as the Natal Code of Native Law. And this was conceived of as early as the 1860s, but it was certainly encoded in 1891 in law, which meant that this entrenched legal systems for the operation of traditional authorities. So when Shepstone set up the Native Affairs Commission, one of the things that they did was separate the rule of being able to adjudicate legislative competence. So criminal law was adjudicated by the magistrates, so murder, etc., was adjudicated by magistrates, whereas your everyday negotiation of legal requirements of running a tribal group or an ethnic group was done by a tribal court. And so the Code of Native Law was basically put together in order to be able to regulate the number of skirmishes, particularly skirmishes resulting in death, which came out of disagreements, particularly with regards to with lobola cattle, marriage cattle. And so the Code of Native Law set down a whole series of rules and effectively prescribed the rules of lobola cattle as being 11 for an ordinary marriage. And the Code of Native Law also wrote down, and this is quite important, they wrote down the text of how the homestead worked. And so this really installed what is tradition for the understandings of tradition for many Zulu people, not only in the 19th and 20th centuries, but in entrenching tradition in contemporary society. And this has been such an indelible document that it is actually still embedded in the way in which tribal courts are run today. So if you were in the missions, if you were a missionary, if you were Ikolwa, you were a convert, one of the things that you were exempted from, and you had to apply for exemption, was you had to apply for exemption from native law. And so on the missions, and this includes the mission at Groutville around Kwadukuza, this includes the mission at Adams Mission, very close to the Umnini location, but this is the mission in contemporary Edendale at Georgetown. In these particular missions, schools were set up, convents started learning how to read and write, and an entire raft of African intelligentsia rose up in these isolated pockets. And these missions were really, really important, as they were the birthplace for much of resistance thinking in the 19th century. And so, for example, if you look at the newspaper Inkanyeso Yase Natale, which was written or presented by the Amakolwa in Edendale, sort of between the late 1880s and the early 1890s, this would have dexterous arguments between the Times of Natal, which was one of the settler-owned newspapers, and they were incredibly critical, but at the same time they were incredibly competent market gardeners who were providing food pretty much for as far north as Ladysmith and as far east, southeast as what is presently Umzimkhulu. But importantly, these particular people were pulled into action, and you can see here the memorial to the Edendale Light Horse, and the Edendale Light Horse was one of the British associated contingents who participated in the Anglo-Zulu War on the side of the British in 1879. So the politics of the 19th century in contemporary KwaZulu-Natal is certainly not very straightforward, as you've got white settlers and white traders working on the side of the Zulus, and you've got black settlers and black military working on the side of the British. So these are all very grey areas that you've just got to keep into your mind and remember to some degree. And then we come to Cetshwayo Mpande. Now, he was Mpande's son. He, as you remember, won the battle against his brother Mboyazi, and he was king and a very important person between 1873 and 1879. And he was important because he was present at the pivotal moment of the Langalibalele rebellion, or the Langalibalele uprising in 1873, and this is a particular element that I really, really feel very strongly about. But this was a guy called Langalibalele Hlubi. He was the king of the Hlubi, who had moved into Natal after 1843, settled in the area where the Boers had settled, in those northernmost areas around Escourt and Ladysmith. These guys became very adept market gardeners. They were providing a lot of fresh goods and vegetables for all the Dutch farmers who were preferring rather to run cattle. Many of his men went off to the diamond works, and they brought back with them guns because they'd been paid in guns. And because of this, the colonial government in Natal didn't like this, and they basically saw Langalibalele's resistance as a rebellion. In the end, he was caught, he was tried, and he was basically stuck between a rock and a hard place, the rock being Theophilus Shepstone, and his big advocate was a guy called Bishop Colenso. And eventually he was sent to Robben Island, and after his imprisonment at Robben Island had ended, he was sent to live underneath the leadership of Teteleku, who is the Zondi chief on the right. And Teteleku was an ally of Shepstone, and he was the chief which was adjacent to the Amakolwa mission at Edendale, at which Langalibalele had sent his daughters. So there's a very grey series of comments and interests here. But certainly the Langalibalele rebellion was a really, really important moment in the rebellious or uprisings or resistance campaigns in the province of, or the colony of Natal. Cetshwayo was also the king who led his people into war in 1873, and many British particularly know of this war because it is indelibly imprinted in their minds. But the Anglo-Zulu War of 1873 was largely started because of a loosely described invasion of some Zulu people into Natal colony, which gave the British an excuse to invade Zululand, and certainly the battles of Isandlwana, in which the Zulu beat the British, and the subsequent Battle of Rorke's Drift, in which the British beat the Zulu. And I think the 11 Victoria Crosses are still the record of Victoria Crosses won in a war. These battles have gone down in legend. And they have also gone down in legend because these particular battles changed significantly the way in which the British ran warfare from then on. Redcoats disappeared because redcoats did not work very well in the landscape of the Zululand climate, as you can see below. The methods of being able to access the ammunition boxes also changed. But also, with the death of Prince Imperial Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in Zululand after the war in 1879, not a single British royal went into war until Prince Andrew participated in the Falklands incidents in the 1980s. So this was a really important part of history. This resulted in Zululand being divided into 13 kingdoms by the Secretary of Native Affairs, and this blurred the lines between chiefship and also diminished the power of Cetshwayo and subsequently the power of the Zulu. So the end of the 19th century started getting very mucky. The end of the 19th century was signified by quite a poor colony trying to recoup the costs of war. There were locust invasions, there were droughts, and then particularly the rinderpest, which was an absolutely calamitous event in 1897. The rinderpest, which was a cattle disease, came south from Kenya, and certainly the proactive action of veterinary science in the colony of Natal, which actually found a vaccination for rinderpest. The proactive action didn't help the Zulu cattle, many of whom died as a result of people not wanting their cattle to be inoculated against the rinderpest. And I think by 1897, something like 80% of Zulu cattle in Zululand had died. And if you consider that cattle were one of the main lifeways of the Zulu people, this was absolutely calamitous. Not only did this mean that they had limited means of being able to pay their hut tax, but this also meant that it pushed Zulu people much quicker into being subservient to the colonists. The lead up also meant that there was very contested lands at the time, at the very end of the 19th century, at the lead up to what is known as the Anglo-Boer War. So now known as the South African War, this occurred between 1899 and 1902, and you can see the colony of Natal in pink. You can see Basutoland, which is adjacent. You can see the Orange Free State, which was a Dutch territory, and you can see the South African Republic, which was that area to the north, currently known as Gauteng, Mpumalanga, and a whole variety of other new provinces. But colony of Natal was effectively surrounded by Dutch territories. And these went into war in 1899, and the Dutch were largely guerrilla fighters. They perfected guerrilla fighting. The British, however, went to war in a very strategic British fashion through formal warfare. And underneath the British, the Boers were basically burnt out. The British imposed a scorched land policy, which meant that Boer farmers were reliant, guerrilla farmers were reliant on isolated homesteads and being able to take shelter. This was basically negated, and women and children were put into concentration camps set up by the British. So an important part of this particular battle, or this particular conflict, is not only the concentration camps which were which were designed by the British in order to basically hog-tie Boer power. But also I believe that this is the first time that barbed wire was used in war. Anyway, so during this particular event, this was significantly international. This particular event resulted in international luminaries such as Mahatma Gandhi, who was a stretcher bearer in this particular war, and he's there in the green circle, but also Winston Churchill, and also the founder of the Scouts, Baden-Powell, amongst others. One of the things which is important is that with war comes settlement, and with war comes innovation, and certainly Pietermaritzburg as a city burst beyond its Boer roots and expanded into becoming a very settled city, and this map of 1906 in the Natal Museum is testimony to this. And from here, Anglo-Boer War, depredations of war, plagues, more locusts, a big snow, other pestilences such as East Coast fever, further decimated African cattle. This led to pivotal moment number 2 in terms of African resistance, which was the Bambata Uprising. And this particularly was a poll tax uprising started by a guy called Bambata, who was a Zondi chief living in the interior of the colony. And this particular uprising was basically a series of small skirmishes which were reacted to and reported to and upscaled by the British to the extent that it became something quite significant. But the uprising was a significant moment in the Boer, rather Zulu protest against British control. Again, this took up money. Again, this pointed to dissatisfaction. The king at the time was Dinizulu. He was basically put up on a treason trial, and his treason trial was hotly defended by Harriet Colenso, the daughter of Bishop Colenso, who had defended so strongly Langalibalele in 1873. So all of these were particularly important political events which coloured the development of the colony of Natal. And so the first decade of the 20th century had territories which were impoverished by war. There was a political imperative for cooperation. And remember, the territories impoverished by war were not only Natal Colony and the Cape Colony, but also the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republic, the South African Republic, and the Orange Free State. And so the political imperative for cooperation was driven in order to be able to come to a common understanding of an early nationalism. And so, in addition, the depredations of locusts, cattle disease, weather conditions, and the Bambata Uprising meant that Natal had no choice but to enter into union. The next section will talk about the formation of union in 1910.